Hi, welcome to this video version of my PhD findings presentation. If you don't know me, I'm Becky, I'm 25, and I've spent the past 3 years exploring eating behaviours, quality of life, coping styles, and symptom severity, alongside investigating factors that impact or change these relationships within a gastroparesis population. I also have gastroparesis, which is one of the main reasons that I'm so passionate about this research and have been tube fed for the past couple of years. The presentation covers a lot of work done over the past 3 years, and if you're watching this, you probably have gastroparesis or potentially work with someone who does. But please remember that there will be a broad range of experiences and understanding of gastroparesis, so I've done my best to make it as easy to understand as possible. There will also be an opportunity at the end for you to participate within my final study, which aims just to get your feedback from what we discuss in this video. I also want to reiterate before I get started that gastroparesis is obviously a physical condition, but that this research hopes to improve psychological well-being when living with gastroparesis, and so it's important to investigate factors that could affect this. Okay, let's get started. So, just some background of the PhD and why this research was needed. Gastroparesis is associated with reduced quality of life, poor psychological well-being, adverse relationships with food, and high levels of symptom burden. However, there's very little research about the way in which gastroparesis impacts these relationships and what factors could improve or affect these relationships. So the PhD was needed to explore this with the aim of improving overall quality of life, reducing symptom burden, and improving eating experience. This was alongside determining factors that we could use within interventions. All participants throughout the PhD studies are 18 plus and have been diagnosed with gastroparesis by a medical professional. For the first phase, we conducted 19 interviews exploring the relationship with food, the psychological impact of gastroparesis, coping mechanisms, and perceptions and thoughts about potential interventions. We wanted to know two main things based on limited previous research findings and suggestions. These were, how is the relationship with food and eating experienced by the individuals with gastroparesis, and what support and interventions do patients want to improve their relationship with food? So, from analysing the interviews, three overarching themes were developed. The first theme, eating to live rather than living to eat, loss and change in the experience of eating with gastroparesis, covers how there's a loss of pleasure when eating, and that gastroparesis has caused food to become feared, which then leads to altered eating behaviours, including avoidant and restrictive eating. I'm going to show some quotes from participants over the next few slides and suggest pausing to read them. So participants talked about how it becomes a survival mechanism to pretend that food is not desired and that the way that they view food has changed from something enjoyable to just fuel. They also discussed how the symptoms have meant that their behaviours and relationship with food has been negatively impacted by gastroparesis. The second theme was It's taken so much joy from me, the impact of gastroparesis on the reduction of pleasurable aspects of life. Within this theme, participants discussed how their gastroparesis has negatively impacted their quality of life and psychological well-being, affecting their mental health as a result. This included increased anxiety and depression, and also negatively affected how they viewed and treated themselves. Participants also discussed that they felt as if their diagnosis was overwhelming and that they felt a lot of shame and humiliation about their condition. Final theme, multitask mindfulness, coping strategies and healthcare hopes, explored participants' diagnostic journey alongside healthcare experiences. Unfortunately, many participants had experienced long diagnostic journeys as well as negative experiences with healthcare professionals. However, they also explained how positive healthcare interactions changed how they were able to cope with the difficulties of gastroparesis, and that having support in place from the beginning of a diagnosis would be beneficial, giving suggestions for interventions that can improve overall quality of life and hopes for future gastroparesis healthcare. The findings from the interviews informed the next three phases of research, as we needed to make sure that these findings were consistent across a wider number of individuals with gastroparesis. Therefore, we looked at the relationships between different factors that can be measured, including eating behaviours and symptoms experienced. After this, we also looked at whether those relationships can be changed by adding in other factors such as self-compassion. The questionnaires that we used to measure relationships between factors that we were assessing are either widely used in gastroparesis research or in research that looks at those other variables. This includes symptom severity and quality of life, specifically in gastroparesis, eating behaviours, how much fat and sugar is eaten within different time frames, self-compassion, mindfulness and mindful eating, meal eating characteristics, again specifically in gastroparesis, including things like portion size, type of diet, oral supplement usage, and so on. And finally, illness identity and coping style. Therefore, our next study investigated relationships between eating behaviours, symptom severity, consumption of symptom-provoking foods, and mindful eating. We also explored whether mindful eating changes the relationship between symptom severity and both eating behaviours and foods consumed. We excluded participants if they did not have any oral intake. Just to give a quick overview of some of the eating behaviours that we were investigating, emotional eating is when someone overeats in response to their emotions. These are normally negative emotions, including stress, frustration, and worry, but can also include positive emotions such as excitement. External eating is when external food cues such as smell and taste lead to increased consumption of foods. Think about going past a bakery and smelling the food there and getting something even if you weren't originally going to. On the other hand, restrained or restrictive eating is when someone eats less. This used to be only to control weight, but now includes other reasons to restrain or restrict eating. In a gastroparesis context, this might be symptoms, for example. As we are also investigating mindful eating within this study, I'm going to quickly define it for you. Mindful eating has two subcategories: paying attention to the sensory element of eating, which includes smell, taste, and look of the food, and also having a non-judgmental awareness of thoughts and feelings that aren't focused on the sensory element when you're eating. It also means not being distracted when you're eating, and also accepting that there is no right or wrong way to eat. As you can see from the quote, when we conducted the interviews, we found that many of the participants were quite judgmental towards themselves when they ate things that they didn't think they should have, maybe because it caused symptoms. So it was important to explore whether mindful eating may be helpful for those with gastroparesis. So, in terms of key findings from this study, we found that when people eat more in response to their emotions, their symptom burden is higher, and they also consume more foods that are high in fat and sugar, both of which are types of foods that are symptom provoking within gastroparesis. Eating more foods that are high in fat and sugar also increased when people ate in response to external food cues such as smell and taste rather than physical hunger. When people are more aware of the sensory experience when eating, one component of mindful eating, they are also less likely to eat due to their emotions. Some of these findings are in line with other populations, but the impact of such behaviours have not been explored within a gastroparesis population, and therefore the impact of these behaviours on areas such as symptoms and psychological well-being was unknown. Within this study, we also looked at whether engaging in mindful eating changes the relationships between gastroparesis symptom severity and both increased consumption of fat and sugar and problematic eating behaviors. We found that when participants did not engage in mindful eating, there was a really strong relationship between increased consumption of fat and sugar increasing symptom severity, but that if people engaged in mindful eating, this really strong relationship no longer existed. Similarly, when people had low levels of non-judgmental awareness when eating, again, another component of mindful eating, there were really strong relationships between increased consumption of fat and sugar causing increased symptoms, and also high levels of restrained or restrictive eating also causing increased symptoms. However, if a participant had high levels of non-judgmental awareness when they were eating, these relationships were no longer significant. So we concluded that if high levels of emotional or external eating is present in people with gastroparesis, it's important to address this as they're more likely to experience increased symptoms due to increased consumption of symptom-provoking foods. We should also specifically encourage non-judgmental awareness when eating, as it should help to reduce symptom severity by reducing consumption of symptom-provoking foods and reducing restrained or restrictive eating. This study was the first to look specifically at emotional or external eating within gastroparesis, and also the first to specifically investigate factors that might help to reduce potentially negative behaviours that lead to increased symptoms. One of our key aims in this study was to see whether mindful eating changes relationships between symptom severity and both eating behaviours and foods consumed. As our findings suggest that only one component of mindful eating, non-judgmental awareness when eating, changes those relationships, we propose that using a combination of both mindful and mindless eating would be beneficial in improving eating behaviors such as restrained or restrictive eating and reducing consumption of symptom-provoking foods. This could look like accepting that you might need to have a different diet from others around you and being kind towards yourself about this, but also engaging in distraction techniques whilst doing this. So in the next study, we explored relationships between quality of life, symptom severity, self-compassion, mindfulness, and mindful eating, whilst also investigating whether these factors change relationships between symptom severity and quality of life. Again, participants in this study were excluded if they did not have any oral intake. It might seem obvious, but I'm going to quickly go over definitions of self-compassion and mindfulness, as sometimes people think that they mean slightly different things from what they actually are. So, self-compassion is when you show compassion towards yourself, specifically the kind of compassion that you would give to your friends and family. And mindfulness is purposely paying attention and being aware of what's happening in the present moment without judgment. Mindfulness and self-compassion interlink, as you cannot be compassionate towards yourself without also being mindful. When we conducted the interviews, pause to read the quotes, it was clear that many of the participants showed low self-compassion and struggled to be mindful, so it was important to explore whether improving these may help with various areas of living with gastroparesis. As expected, we found that high levels of symptoms lead to reduced quality of life, but that if participants had high levels of self-compassion and mindfulness, then their overall quality of life was higher. We also found that mindful eating was not associated at all with symptom severity or quality of life within this study. In this study, we were investigating whether self-compassion, mindfulness, and mindful eating changed the relationship between high levels of symptom severity leading to low levels of quality of life, and found that when participants had low levels of self-compassion or mindfulness, the relationship between high levels of symptom severity leading to low levels of quality of life was really strong. However, if participants had average to high levels of self-compassion or mindfulness, that really strong relationship no longer existed. So our findings in this study suggest that interventions that target self-compassion and mindfulness will improve quality of life, which will in turn hopefully improve symptom severity within gastroparesis patients. Whilst mindful eating was not a significant factor that changed relationships, these findings still support the previous study as being non-judgmental towards yourself, whether this is when eating or in other areas of life, is a key component of both self-compassion and mindfulness. The findings from the study were the first to show that self-compassion and mindfulness are key psychological factors that could be targeted to improve quality of life within gastroparesis, which would hopefully have an impact on burden of symptoms. Like I said earlier, targeting these within interventions does not change the fact that gastroparesis is a physical condition, but could help to improve psychological well-being. Both self-compassion and mindfulness are protective factors against poor psychological health and maladaptive coping styles, both of which are associated with increased symptom severity and poor quality of life within gastroparesis. So it's then important to determine whether having higher levels of self-compassion and mindfulness within gastroparesis would improve coping styles and quality of life for patients. This may look like actively engaging in practices that improve self-compassion and mindfulness, or by trying to address problematic coping skills. But this has not been investigated within gastroparesis, and it was important to explore this in order to make those recommendations. Therefore, we explored whether both self-compassion and mindfulness may change relationships between quality of life, symptom severity, and also coping style. This was in order to establish how factors that could be implemented, self-compassion and mindfulness, within various interventions may impact the effectiveness of potential interventions that aim to improve quality of life and coping ability within gastroparesis. In this study, as we were not specifically looking at mindful eating, which possesses the need to eat orally, participants just needed to be 18 plus and diagnosed with gastroparesis. So we found that when participants had low levels of self-compassion, the relationship between participants who have maladaptive coping styles, which includes things such as expressing negative self-perceptions, using substances, ignoring symptoms, and so on, and high levels of symptom severity was extremely significant. However, when participants had average to high levels of self-compassion, the relationship between high amounts of maladaptive coping and increased symptoms no longer existed. We also explored whether illness identity explains relationships between quality of life, symptom severity, self-compassion, and mindfulness, and to what degree. There are four illness identities: engulfment, rejection, acceptance, and enrichment, and these refer to how well the individual has integrated their sense of self with their illness. Many of you will probably have heard of the grief reaction and will probably see parallels with that, but I'm going to quickly explain these on the next slides. Both engulfment and rejection describe a lack of integration of gastroparesis into the person's sense of self. Engulfment refers to how much the illness dominates one's daily life and identity, whereas rejection is when a person completely rejects the condition as part of their identity and instead views it as a threat. It was important to explore this within gastroparesis as, if illness identity is not well integrated into individuals' lives, it may mean that behaviours that will lead to increased quality of life, such as treatment adherence, management of symptoms, and positive eating behaviours, are neglected. This was also evident when conducting the interviews previously. I'd pause the video here just to have a quick read of what participants said. So as you can see, some participants, especially those who had either been recently diagnosed or had had rapid changes in their health as a result of gastroparesis, struggled to integrate it into their lives and discussed feeling overwhelmed with the diagnosis and wanting to be viewed as a person without their gastroparesis. Within a gastroparesis population, people who are engulfed by it in their gastroparesis may be more likely to have extremely strict diets, not go out as they're scared of symptoms, or unable to think of anything other than their gastroparesis. Whereas those who have a rejection identity may eat whatever they like, not take any medications that are prescribed, and may not seek out healthcare when needed. On the other hand, acceptance and enrichment pose a more accepting view of the condition and are associated with positive impacts such as increased appreciation for life and priorities. Acceptance refers to the degree to which the condition is accepted as part of life without it being overwhelming, and enrichment is the degree to which the condition has brought about positive changes, enriching the person's sense of self, and results in personal growth. This was also seen within the interviews. Again, I'd pause here. The participants who discussed accepting their diagnosis and being enriched by it had generally been diagnosed for longer, highlighting that illness identities are transitional and that various factors such as support networks will affect them. Within a gastroparesis context, having an acceptance identity may look like following a diet and taking medication as needed, but not avoiding social occasions as a result of their gastroparesis. And being enriched by their gastroparesis may mean sharing and educating with friends and family about the condition and using those experiences to grow in various areas of life. Previous findings that have been discussed looked at how things like self-compassion and mindfulness change specific relationships. These next findings look more at how illness identities may indirectly influence the relationships between both self-compassion and mindfulness against both symptom severity and quality of life. So, when we found that people scored highly on self-compassion, their scores for being engulfed by their gastroparesis decreased. If people scored highly on being engulfed by their gastroparesis, they also scored highly on symptom severity and lower quality of life. Essentially, if gastroparesis dominates someone's life, their quality of life is reduced and they score more highly on symptom severity. But if we improve self-compassion, then their gastroparesis dominating their life should reduce, thereby decreasing the impact of their symptoms and improving their quality of life. If someone scores highly on illness engulfment, it means that practitioners can be aware that interventions that encompass self-compassion may be more difficult and take more time to see positive outcomes for those individuals, but by being aware can take this into account. Interestingly, we also found that when participants scored highly on self-compassion, their scores for being enriched by their gastroparesis increased, but also had increased symptom severity scores when they had higher scores on illness enrichment. We weren't expecting this result, but this could be due to those being enriched by their gastroparesis having higher symptom burden but have transitioned through various illness identities, finally reaching the enrichment phase, or as a result of being diagnosed for a longer period of time. Obviously, this does not mean that these patients would not need support from healthcare professionals, but it would suggest that even if symptom burden is high, helping individuals with gastroparesis to reach a more accepting and integrated view of their gastroparesis will help to support those with engulfment identities to have improved psychological well-being. So from the overall findings within Phase 4, we concluded that any suggested interventions should target increasing self-compassion, which should improve coping skills and therefore reduce maladaptive coping style. As said previously, gastroparesis is a physical condition, but by improving coping skills and reducing maladaptive coping behaviours, it may help to reduce burden of symptoms. However, we also concluded that it's incredibly important for anyone who would be delivering any interventions to also be aware of the person's illness identity due to the potential that it may not be as effective if this is also not addressed. So what are the final overarching conclusions for the PhD? Gastroparesis has major impacts on various aspects of life, and participants expressed that proactive psychological support would be beneficial, alongside dietary and medical intervention, with the understanding that a combination approach is needed to improve psychological well-being, but also needs to be alongside the correct medical management of the condition. In terms of psychological interventions, these need to aim to improve self-compassion, which includes elements of mindfulness, alongside addressing any potentially adverse eating behaviours. This would be to improve overall quality of life by improving ability to cope, which won't take symptoms away, but could reduce the impact of them. Healthcare practitioners also need to be aware of how illness identity could impact ability to engage or affect interventions that are offered, and provide support to those who may be at high risk of barriers, reducing the benefit of these. Obviously, please take into account that the results that I've discussed today are the key findings from the studies, and I've tried to share the headline conclusions for each piece of research, and as such, any further research will need to take multiple things into account. Therefore, future suggestions for research would be to conduct a small study assessing acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, as a potential intervention, as it encompasses multiple areas that have been investigated within my PhD. ACT improves both self-compassion and mindfulness, identifies a person's core beliefs, which could help ascertain their illness identity, and also improves coping strategies. This would be done alongside support from medical or dietary healthcare practitioners in order to improve any adverse eating behaviours and provide more holistic support around nutrition. That concludes the presentation on my PhD findings. As I mentioned at the beginning, I'm also conducting a final study that aims to get your evaluation and feedback from my findings and suggestions for interventions. Your feedback will be used to inform future research, and I'd be really appreciative if you could take part. In particular, having your feedback will help to ensure that our findings reflect your reality, and as we're aiming to create interventions after my PhD is finished, we want to ensure that they are interventions that you as people who have gastroparesis want and need. Essentially, it's your opportunity to really be heard. So if you'd like to participate within the study, please scan the QR code on the screen or click the link that will be below. Thank you for watching this video. If you have any questions about the research discussed within this presentation, please email me using the email on the screen. There are also some contact details for charities who may be able to support you if you found some of the content discussed within this video difficult. Thank you again. Bye!